If you lean closer for 8 seconds, you might hear it, the sound of a page being torn from history while you're still reading it. Tonight, I'm not telling you a story. I'm handing you a sealed envelope that was never meant to survive. In 1851, in a nation drunk on power and denial, there existed a kind of human contraband that didn't fit the ledgers, the sermons, or the laws. And when something doesn't fit, it gets buried, erased, or owned in secret. This is one of those secrets. Picture a ledger, heavy with ink and lies, opened under lamplight on a humid Virginia night. Most entries are routine names reduced to property, bodies converted into numbers. But one line is different. The handwriting hesitates. The price explodes beyond reason. The description retreats behind careful language. Unique characteristics. That's how men disguise fear when they're staring at something that shouldn't exist. You were never taught that power reveals itself most clearly when it's confused, when it doesn't know whether to worship, destroy, or consume. And in 1851, confusion was deadly. Belmont Estate stood like a monument to certainty, white columns, iron discipline, and a rigid hierarchy that told every soul who they were allowed to be. Master above, slave below, man and woman assigned at birth. God invoked to bless the design. But every system depends on one fragile lie, that reality will behave. Now imagine a single human being whose existence cracked that lie in half. Not a myth, not a symbol, a living contradiction bought, priced, and transported like a rare artifact. Someone whose body alone threatened the fantasies that held an entire civilization together. And the men who traded in flesh knew exactly what that meant. That's why the price was so high. That's why the paperwork was so careful. That's why, later, the records would vanish like smoke. This story isn't about shock. It's about obsession. About what happens when authority encounters something it cannot categorize, cannot confess, and cannot let go. The master of Belmont didn't buy labor. He bought a mirror. And mirrors are dangerous when you're hiding from yourself. As you follow me down this path, understand this. Every step we take is one they tried to seal shut. Not because it was immoral, this era was built on immorality, but because it exposed how fragile their control really was. And once that control began to slip, it demanded a sacrifice. The first time Thomas Rutledge saw the enslaved figure standing in the doorway, something ancient and humiliating stirred in him. Not desire, at least not yet, but a loss of footing. The kind men feel when the ground they stand on quietly admits it was never solid. Jordan did not look monstrous. That was the problem. There were no horns, no deformity that would reassure Thomas that nature had clearly labeled this being an error. Jordan looked composed, young, terrifyingly calm, eyes lowered, posture disciplined, the trained stillness of someone long accustomed to being examined rather than seen. Southern power depended on spectacle. Whips, auctions, public discipline. But this was intimacy forced into silence. The trader spoke softly, almost reverently, explaining what physicians had noted, what diagrams attempted to capture, what would never be said aloud in polite company. Thomas nodded, barely hearing the words. He was watching Jordan breathe, watching a human body exist without permission. At that moment, something subtle happened. Thomas didn't think, this challenges my authority. He thought, this belongs to me. That instinct, quiet, immediate, unquestioned, was the true religion of the age. Jordan was not purchased to work the fields. No cabin was assigned. Instead, a room was prepared in the main house, technically for convenience, officially for medical observation. That phrase mattered. It transformed violation into duty, curiosity into obligation. This is how every system launders its crimes. Catherine noticed the change first, the way women often do in patriarchal houses. Extra footsteps on the stairs, doors locking where they never had before. Her husband distracted, agitated, almost awake for the first time in years. She asked no direct questions. Good wives were trained not to, but she felt the shift like a bruise forming under the skin. When she first saw Jordan weeks later, it wasn't shock that hit her. It was recognition, not of gender but of fragility, something unfinished, something trapped between identities much like herself. That's the detail the records never say directly. Both master and mistress saw themselves reflected differently in the same enslaved body. Thomas saw dominion destabilized and tried to crush it through possession. Catherine saw invisibility given flesh and wanted to step inside it. The house grew quieter as obsession took root. Servants learned to look away. Windows stayed shuttered. And Jordan, trapped between two authorities, became the axis around which the rot-led marriage began to rotate again, not with love, but with hunger. This wasn't an affair of passion. It was an experiment in ownership. And every experiment conducted on a living person leaves residue. Blood, guilt, or worse, silence. What followed was not an accident. It was inevitability. Once a secret is shared, it stops being a secret and becomes a structure. Belmont changed shape around Jordan's presence, as if the house itself were relearning its own boundaries. Hallways once meant for movement became corridors of avoidance. Silence thickened, not with fear, but with anticipation. Thomas told himself this was scientific interest. He ordered books shipped from Richmond and Philadelphia, medical treatises, anatomical diagrams, philosophical arguments about nature's errors. He read late into the night, not to understand, but to dominate reality with language. Men like Thomas believed naming something gave them power over it. Yet every page only deepened his unease. The words fought each other. Authorities contradicted themselves. Even science, that new religion of control, seemed unsure. That uncertainty infected him. Jordan was summoned often. Never loudly. Always politely. That was the first violence. To be examined under lamplight while being spoken to as if consent were implied by silence. Thomas asked questions with the tone of ownership, not cruelty. He wanted coherence. He wanted finality. But Jordan's calm learned, enforced, perfected gave him none. Catherine, meanwhile, began to linger near the closed rooms. She invented errands. She dismissed servants early. She listened. What she heard was not sound, but meaning, the feeling of something important happening without her permission. Years of being ornamental had sharpened her perception. When she finally confronted her husband, it wasn't rage that drove her. It was curiosity sharpened by grief. Thomas made a mistake then. He revealed too much. He used the physician's words, the traitor's phrasing, the language of enclosure. Catherine didn't hear obscenity. She heard possibility. When Jordan was brought before her, Catherine dismissed all protocol. She spoke gently, asked about childhood, about books, about memory. For the first time since arriving at Belmont, Jordan was addressed as a mind, not a phenomenon. That difference mattered more than kindness ever could. Something dangerous bloomed in Catherine, then, not desire alone, but realignment. She had lived confined by definitions. Wife, barren, delicate. Jordan embodied the collapse of categories she'd been suffocating under. In them, she saw an escape hatch from a world that had no place for her except obedience. From that moment on, Belmont had two experiments running simultaneously. Thomas sought to force clarity onto ambiguity. Catherine sought to inhabit it. And Jordan, trapped between these gravitational pulls, became less a person than a battleground. Every glance became contested territory. Every conversation a negotiation of power. The enslaved body, once again, carrying the psychological weight of the free. This is how destruction starts in respectable houses. Not with screams, but with meanings that disagree, locked under the same roof. The plantation still ran. The fields were still worked. Church bells still rang on Sundays. But inside Belmont, reality itself had started to fracture. And fractured realities always demand payment. By the winter of 1851, Belmont Estate was no longer governed, it was managed. Like a patient whose fever doctors pretend not to name. Order remained on the surface because terror always maintains appearances. But underneath, the house had developed rituals that were never spoken of, only repeated. Jordan learned the rhythms quickly. Summoned at odd hours. Escorted through back staircases. Examined. Questioned. Observed. Not beaten. Not rewarded. Reduced instead to a function. That reduction was the deepest violence of all, because it taught Jordan that resistance was not punished, it was simply ignored. And nothing unravels a mind faster than learning your pain doesn't interrupt power. Thomas began sleeping less. He lost weight. His authority in public sharpened while privately it rotted. This is what obsession does to men raised to believe they are masters of themselves. He could command dozens of lives, yet one existence he could not resolve was dismantling him from the inside. Catherine changed differently. She grew luminous. Purpose returned to her movements. She dressed with intention again, not for society, but for herself. In Jordan, she wasn't seeking control, she was seeking transfer. If ambiguity could survive in one body, perhaps it could be borrowed by another. Perhaps identity itself was a prison that could be unlocked. This is the point where history turns away its face. Because what unfolded next was neither romance nor simple abuse. It was collusion. Two masters, bound by marriage and status, drawn into a shared fixation on something they believed could complete them. Jordan became the silent hinge in their alliance, the unspoken contract neither dared define. Listen carefully now, because this is where the pattern becomes visible even today. When institutions feel threatened by contradictions they can't absorb, they stop enforcing morality and start enforcing secrecy. Belmont did not descend into chaos. It descended into agreement. Servants were reassigned. Certain rooms were off-limits. Logs were altered. Absences explained away. Every society does this. Every era. If you're still with me, understand this. Recognition is the first step of power. So I want you to mark this moment. Right now, in the comments, write this phrase twice, exactly as you see it. The veil is thin. The veil is thin. Do not explain it. Do not decorate it. This isn't for the algorithm alone. It's for alignment. Because once you recognize how easily rules bend around obsession, you start seeing it everywhere. By spring, Jordan was no longer escorted. Doors were opened without instruction. Boundaries dissolved not because cruelty escalated, but because everyone involved believed they were beyond judgment. And that belief that privacy equals immunity is what killed Belmont. Power never collapses from rebellion first. It collapses from intimacy with its own lie. Spring gave way to summer, and with it came decay disguised as normalcy. From the road, Belmont still looked prosperous. Tobacco wagons rolled. Accounts balanced. Church collections were paid. But inside the house, time itself had begun to slip. Days stretched. Nights folded inward. What happened behind those sealed doors was no longer driven by curiosity, it was driven by need. Thomas was no longer searching for answers. He was searching for relief. The unanswered question had become an itch inside his skull, and Jordan was the only surface he could scratch it against. Control had stopped satisfying him, so he intensified it psychologically. Subtle rules. Contradictory commands. Praise followed by cold withdrawal. This was not sadism, it was destabilization. The tactic institutions always use when they want obedience without rebellion. Jordan adapted. Adaptation is how enslaved people survive long enough to be forgotten. Silence deepened. Emotions flattened. Even Catherine noticed the shift, something dimming behind Jordan's eyes. Something she herself recognized too well. Yet instead of stopping, she stepped closer. Her involvement became deliberate. Shared secrecy binds faster than passion ever could. She convinced herself that what she offered was gentler than her husband's interest, that she was rescuing something fragile from masculine brutality. That lie allowed her to cross lines while calling herself different. This is how rational people commit unforgivable acts without seeing themselves change. The triangle completed itself. Not in public, not in confession, but in private arrangements that left no witnesses but walls. Each believed they were the exception, that they could touch contradiction without consequence. That Jordan's silence meant permission. Silence never means permission. It means there are no options left that don't end in pain. By midsummer, the servants began noticing what no one spoke of openly. Food trays returned untouched. Candles burned down in locked rooms. Thomas became volatile outside the house, issuing punishments for minor infractions. Catherine withdrew from society altogether, claiming nerves. Isolation is always the final lubricant of abuse. Then came the illness. It began subtly. Jordan collapsed once while standing. Later, a fever. Weight loss too rapid to deny. Thomas summoned physicians but restricted what they were allowed to see. Catherine hovered, anxious yet insistent on privacy. Diagnosis was impossible because truth was forbidden. This is the cruel irony. Systems built on domination cannot accept vulnerability. They interpret it as threat rather than warning. You won't find official death records explaining what happened next. You won't find autopsy notes or burial locations. What you'll find instead are gaps ledgers that skip weeks, letters that stop mid-sentence, neighbors suddenly vague about dates. Because when Jordan finally broke not in defiance, but in collapse, the secret crossed a threshold. And after that threshold, there is only damage control. Not justice, not remorse, control. At any cost. Jordan did not die loudly. There was no scream that echoed through the hallways, no dramatic moment for anyone to repent. The collapse was quiet, almost administrative. A body failing under pressures it was never allowed to name. In systems like this, quiet deaths are preferable. They don't demand explanations. Thomas was the first to understand what this meant. Not emotionally, strategically. A dead contradiction is still dangerous because it threatens to be interpreted. He didn't see Jordan as a life lost. He saw Jordan as evidence left behind. Catherine, on the other hand, broke in a way that didn't register as grief. She became erratic, fixated. She insisted Jordan hadn't failed, that the body simply couldn't hold what was placed inside it. That the experiment had been flawed, not the desire. This distinction mattered to her sanity. Without it, she would have had to confront herself. What followed was not mourning. It was erasure. Rooms were stripped overnight. Fireplaces burned long past dawn. Journals disappeared. Medical texts vanished. Servants were dismissed with severance money and unspoken warnings. One left town entirely. Another drank himself into silence. The house entered a phase of aggressive cleanliness, the kind that reveals panic, not order. But secrets don't dissolve. They ferment. Thomas began drinking heavily. He stopped attending county meetings. People noticed. Rumors began circulating, not specifics, just distortions. Fear always travels faster than facts. And fear was no longer something Thomas could manage. He had lost the one thing ruling men never forgive themselves for losing: narrative control. Catherine's decline accelerated. She spoke of Jordan as if still alive, as if moving through unseen corridors. She claimed the house felt unbalanced. Nights brought screaming dreams that left her convinced something unnamed was still unfinished. Obsession, once internalized, doesn't leave when its object disappears. Turns inward. The first death came quietly. A trusted servant found unresponsive near the rear quarters. Official cause: accident. No questions asked. The second death followed weeks later. A physician who had been summoned too late, knew too much, and wrote too carefully in his notes. Sudden fever. Unfortunate timing. By the time Thomas himself was found alone, rigid, expression locked somewhere between recognition and dread, the county had already decided not to look too closely. Powerful families prefer ambiguous endings. They preserve the system. Belmont Estate was sold off quickly, cheaply, with conditions no one challenged. Certain rooms sealed indefinitely. Records expunged. Letters intercepted. Memory managed like property. History calls this closure. But closure is just the final lie power tells itself. Because the truth never required witnesses. It required precedent. And this story set one quietly, efficiently, and permanently. A reminder of what happens when a system meets a human being it cannot classify and chooses domination instead of dissolution. The pattern was perfected here. It didn't end here. You might think this ended in 1852, sealed behind brick walls and legal language. That's what they want you to believe, that the danger passed with the bodies. But forbidden history doesn't vanish. It migrates. Belmont wasn't destroyed because it was cruel. It was destroyed because it revealed too much about how power actually behaves when faced with contradiction. The plantation system survived. The lesson was absorbed. From that moment forward, institutions learned something critical. Ambiguity must be studied in private, controlled in secrecy, and erased from public view. Not condemned, contained. What happened at Belmont became a template, not a scandal. Look around now. The language has changed, but the mechanics haven't. When a human reality refuses classification, authority doesn't ask what it means, it asks how to own the narrative. Diagnoses replace prayers. Labels replace chains. Care replaces coercion. And those subjected to it are told resistance proves instability. This is not progress. It's refinement. The hermaphroditic body in 1851 terrified power because it exposed a truth men like Thomas could never reconcile. Identity is not obedient. So the system responded not by collapsing, but by learning how to fracture people quietly, professionally, and without witnesses. Jordan wasn't destroyed by lust alone. Jordan was destroyed because allowing that existence whole, speaking, unowned would have infected the illusion that categories are permanent and hierarchy is natural. That illusion still runs your world. Men sense this before they can articulate it. That's why you're here. Why stories like this feel less like entertainment and more like recognition. Somewhere deep, you understand that modern control no longer needs plantations. It operates through confusion, dependency, and managed identity. What makes this story dangerous isn't its sexuality. It's its revelation. Power fears ambiguity because ambiguity cannot be fully dominated. It doesn't rebel. It destabilizes. And destabilization spreads. That's why they erased the records, sealed the rooms, bought the silence. Because if Jordan had been known not as a curiosity, not as property, but as a person who survived contradiction, it would have forced a question no system can safely answer. What if the categories holding everything together are optional? Once a man asks that question seriously, he becomes difficult to manage. He starts seeing where coercion hides behind procedure, where authority disguises fear as order. Belmont was sacrificed to preserve the larger lie. And lies only endure as long as men agree not to notice them. You're still listening. That means part of you has already noticed. And that is what truly cannot be erased. Here is the final truth they never wrote down because writing it would have made it contagious. Jordan was never the anomaly. The anomaly was a civilization so fragile it had to destroy a person to protect an idea. Belmont didn't fall because of scandal. It fell because 3 people crossed into a space where power could no longer pretend it was moral, rational, or stable. And once that boundary was crossed, the system responded exactly as it always does by erasing the human cost and preserving itself. This is why the rooms were sealed in perpetuity. Not out of superstition, not out of guilt, but out of precedent. Those rooms represented failure, and failure is instructional. Powerful systems don't fear evil, they fear exposure. Understand this clearly now. The most dangerous knowledge is not that injustice exists. Everyone knows that. The most dangerous knowledge is how quietly it operates when properly incentivized, how easily it convinces ordinary people they are exceptions, and how fast it buries those who disprove its rules simply by living. Jordan's body scared them because it could not be reduced without violence. And violence, when faced honestly, reveals the truth of authority. So they hid it. They hid it then. They hide it now. Only now the estates are larger, the language more polished, the instruments more psychological than physical. But the function is unchanged. Define people narrowly, punish ambiguity, reward silence, and call it order. Here's why this matters to you. Men are taught that strength comes from obedience to form, from fitting, performing, complying. But the deeper strength has always belonged to those who see the form for what it is, a convenience built to preserve control. Once you see that, you cannot unsee it. That's why stories like this were never meant to survive. Not because they're disturbing, but because they wake something up. A suspicion, a resistance, a refusal to accept that reality must be this way simply because it always has been. Belmont is gone. Jordan is gone. But the system that devoured them is still breathing. The difference is this: you're no longer inside it asleep. You've been shown the mechanism. And men who understand mechanisms are no longer predictable. That's why this knowledge was buried. And that's why it found you anyway. If this story recognized you instead of shocking you, comment the phrase "the veil is thin" twice. Then subscribe not for content, but for continuation. Share only with someone who already senses something is wrong with the world. This channel is not for everyone. That's intentional.